There is a particular kind of optimism that only exists when everything seems to be working. When the economy is growing, when new products are flooding the market, when credit is easy to access, and the future feels like it belongs to everyone, that is when people stop asking whether the system is sustainable and start asking how much more they can get. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is actually a very rational response to the signals the environment is sending. The problem is that those signals are sometimes lying, and by the time people realize it, the damage has already been done. The 1920s in the United States were exactly that kind of era. The decade followed the end of World War I, a period of enormous death and uncertainty. And when it ended, there was a collective exhale across the Western world. America in particular entered a phase of rapid industrial expansion. Cars were being manufactured at scale for the first time. Radios were entering homes. Refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, appliances that had never existed as consumer products were suddenly available, and not just to the wealthy. They were available to ordinary working people. And the mechanism that made this possible was something relatively new in the consumer economy: installment credit. Before the 1920s, the dominant cultural attitude toward debt was deeply negative. Borrowing money was associated with desperation, with failure, with a kind of moral weakness. The idea that a responsible person would go into debt to buy a luxury item, something they did not strictly need to survive, would have been considered reckless by most of the previous generation. But the economy was changing faster than the culture could adjust to it, and manufacturers needed a way to sell expensive products to people who could not afford to pay for them outright. The solution was the installment plan. Pay a little now, pay the rest in small amounts over time, and take the product home today. This was psychologically brilliant because it separated the feeling of ownership from the reality of cost. When you pay for something in full, you feel the weight of that transaction. Your bank account drops, you see the number, and your brain registers the loss. But when you pay in installments, each individual payment feels small and manageable, and the object you bought feels like it is already yours. The debt becomes almost invisible. Background noise rather than a financial reality. This cognitive separation between ownership and cost is one of the most important mechanisms in modern consumer psychology, and it was essentially invented and normalized during the 1920s. By the middle of the decade, consumer credit had exploded. People were buying cars on credit, furniture on credit, radios on credit, and they were also buying something else on credit that would prove far more dangerous. They were buying stocks. The stock market in the late 1920s was experiencing what we now recognize as a speculative bubble, but at the time, it looked like the rational response to a genuinely expanding economy. Companies were producing real products that people wanted. Profits were real, at least for a while. And as stock prices rose, more people wanted in. And many of them did not have the cash to participate, so they borrowed. Buying stocks on margin, essentially using debt to purchase assets that were themselves expected to rise in value, became common practice, and it created a system that was structurally fragile in ways that almost nobody was openly discussing. What makes this history so difficult to look away from is not the crash that followed, although the crash was devastating. What makes it difficult is the recognition of the pattern. Because the psychological architecture of the 1920s debt boom, the installment credit, the asset speculation, the cultural normalization of borrowing, the sense that the future would always be better than the present. Consider what the modern financial environment looks like from a structural standpoint. Consumer credit is not just available, it is actively marketed. Credit cards, buy now, pay later services, personal loans, auto loans, student loans. The mechanisms for accessing debt have multiplied and become frictionless in ways that make the installment plans of the 1920s look primitive. The psychological engineering behind modern credit products is extraordinarily sophisticated. Interest rates are often obscured by minimum payment structures. The true cost of a purchase made on a credit card carrying a balance is rarely presented clearly at the point of sale. The gap between what something feels like it costs and what it actually costs over time when interest compounds is one of the most consequential gaps in personal financial literacy. To understand this mathematically, consider a relatively simple example. If you carry a balance of $4,000 on a credit card with an annual interest rate of 22% and you make only the minimum payment each month, the payoff timeline extends dramatically. Depending on how the minimum is calculated, you could be looking at more than a decade of payments and a total interest cost that nearly doubles the original purchase price. The product you bought, the television, the appliance, the vacation, has long since depreciated or been consumed, but the financial obligation continues, compounding quietly in the background. This is not a rare edge case. This is the mathematical reality for a significant portion of consumer debt held in developed economies today. The parallel to the 1920s runs deeper than just credit mechanics. It runs through the asset speculation layer as well. In the late 1920s, ordinary people with no prior investment experience entered the stock market with borrowed money because rising prices made participation feel inevitable and non-participation feel like a mistake. The language around this was optimistic and forward-looking. The economy was strong, technology was advancing, and the idea that prices might not simply continue rising indefinitely was dismissed as pessimism. Today, the behavioral patterns around speculative assets, whether in equity markets, real estate, or newer digital asset classes, carry unmistakable echoes of that structure. Retail participation in markets increases during periods of rapid price appreciation. Credit-facilitated investment products exist across multiple asset classes, and the cultural framing around participation tends to emphasize opportunity rather than risk, because opportunity is what people want when prices are rising. What is important to understand here is not that any particular asset class will collapse or that any specific outcome is inevitable. History does not repeat with that kind of precision. What it does do is rhyme in terms of the psychological and structural conditions that make populations vulnerable to financial stress. The conditions that make a debt-fueled economy feel exciting are the same conditions that make it fragile. When credit is cheap, confidence is high, and assets are appreciating, the system rewards risk-taking and punishes caution, right up until the moment when it stops. And the people who suffer most when it stops are almost never the architects of the system. They are the participants who were told that the system was working in their favor. This is where the personal dimension of this history becomes most important to sit with, because the question is not simply a macroeconomic one about system design. It is a psychological one about how individuals navigate environments that are specifically engineered to encourage certain behaviors. The installment plan of 1925 and the buy now, pay later button of today are solving the same problem from the lender's perspective. How do you get someone to commit to a financial obligation before they have fully calculated the cost? The answer, in both cases, is speed and friction reduction. Make the decision fast. Make the commitment easy. Let the math become someone else's problem, usually the borrower's, and usually later. Understanding this pattern does not mean refusing to participate in the modern economy. Credit can be a legitimate tool. Investment carries real potential alongside real risk. The goal is not to retreat. The people who navigated the 1920s with the most long-term stability were not the ones who predicted the crash. Very few people did, and those who claimed to were often just lucky with their timing. They were the ones who had built financial structures that did not depend on the expansion continuing indefinitely. Manageable obligations, assets that were not purely speculative, spending patterns that left room for uncertainty. These are not exciting strategies. They do not feel like participation in a boom, but they are the strategies that tend to translate across economic cycles, regardless of what the specific mechanism of the next disruption turns out to be. The 1920s ended. The credit structures collapsed.